Good evening, and welcome to Eerie Echoes. Tonight, we descend into the misty peaks of the Appalachian Mountains, lands where every stone holds a story and every shadow hides a secret. These are not just legends, but true fears, lived and told by real witnesses. Turn off the lights, and remember, the mountains never forget, and they never forgive. First, let us descend toward a mine that was sealed decades ago, yet at night, it still remembers how to breathe. I used to be a mine inspector. Years retired now, but some duties never leave you, especially when old friends call in panic. One such friend owned land near Raleigh County. On the edge of his woods sat a rusted gate, locked and forgotten, covering what used to be a portal to an abandoned coal seam. For weeks, he and his neighbors swore they'd heard noises there after midnight, an underground drone like a slow fan turning, sometimes sharper noises, hammer strikes, faint but deliberate. I didn't believe him, not fully, but I knew enough to check. I went out one evening armed with an old gas meter, a carbon monoxide alarm, a notepad, and my stubborn curiosity. The portal was chained and wrapped in sagging wire fence. A warning sign, yellowed, cracked, barely legible, still read, "Danger, sealed shaft." Beyond it stood the black mouth of the mountain, framed by rotten beams and a collapsed ventilation pipe. The air was unnaturally cool. My meters showed nothing. Oxygen levels steady, no methane spike, no carbon monoxide. Safe. And yet, from behind the bars came that hum, deep, guttural, alive. I pressed my ear to the steel. Tap, tap, tap. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 again. The rhythm was too perfect to be water dripping, too steady to be shifting stone. Miners used that code to signal, "I am here." Against my better judgment, I rapped 3 times with my knuckles. A full breath later, the same pattern answered. My throat went dry. Years earlier, official reports had said the mine was shut after minor instability. But in the dusty archives of the Union Hall, the story was different. 3 men trapped, funneled into an emergency air gallery that was never mapped properly. That gallery was quietly abandoned, buried on paper. But what if... The sound of metal snapped me back. To my left on the wall hung an emergency call box, ancient, dead, half-eaten by rust. Yet as I stepped toward it, the phone rang. 2 shrill chimes. Then silence. I froze. That phone hadn't had power in decades. I didn't touch it. Couldn't. The next day, I pulled the old closure records. That emergency gallery was mentioned once, then struck out, as if someone had decided it didn't exist. 3 names, listed as casualties, their bodies never retrieved. The following evening I returned, rain whispering through the trees. The hum had changed, lower, pulsing, like the mine itself was exhaling. Then I saw it, a glimmer in the dark behind the bars. Not flame, not spark. Just a metallic flash, faint but intentional. And then, tap, tap, tap. I nearly ran, but something held me, that stubborn sense that when the dead knock, it's wrong to ignore them. On the 4th night, I didn't go alone. A deputy came with me, armed with nothing more than a floodlight and skepticism. "Hear that hum?" I asked. He did. "That's air pressure," he said. "The wind moving through." Then the knocks came again. 3 sharp raps. The deputy went pale. He turned, muttered, "Let's leave it," and didn't look back. I stayed long enough to touch the fence again. The cold vibrated into my hand like a breath. Later back in town, I left a small miner's helmet on the gate. A tribute, a warning, maybe both. Now when people pass the old shaft, they say the same thing. Thursday nights, especially after rain, the ground itself groans. You can chalk it up to science if you want. Shifting stone, water pressure, but science doesn't make a dead telephone ring. Remember this. A closed mine in Appalachia doesn't mean a safe mine. Gas, collapse, forgotten tunnels. Sometimes silence is the only warning you'll get. And sometimes silence itself is a lie. Now leave the cold breath of stone behind. Walk with me into the woods, where a lonely cabin sits with its windows nailed shut. Our next tale takes us to a cabin hidden deep among the pines, where the glass panes never open, because they are not meant to. Harold was a hunter, the sort of man who claimed the forest by instinct. But one October evening he lost the trail. Dusk thickened quickly, the trees swallowing the last pale light, and soon the only guidance was the orange glow of his flashlight beam. When the cabin appeared, it seemed like luck. Its roof sagged but stood. Its chimney leaned but held. The front door gaped slightly as though waiting for him. He pushed it open with the muzzle of his rifle. The hinges groaned, but the air inside was strangely still, carrying only the dry smell of ash. On the table sat a chipped mug, half full of black coffee, cold but not long abandoned. Beside it, a map with roads furiously crossed out. In the margin, 3 words scrawled in shaky ink: "Don't open the windows." Harold laughed nervously, probably some hermit's paranoia. Still, he set his pack down carefully. The cot in the corner was ragged, but better than the forest floor. He decided to stay. That night, the forest pressed against the cabin walls. Wind rattled the shingles. Somewhere far off, a fox barked once. Then came the scratching, soft at first, then harder, scraping along the outside of the glass panes. Harold sat upright, rifle in hand. His flashlight beam caught the window, fogged with condensation. And there, pressed against the other side of the glass, was a handprint. Large, wrongly large. The fingers spread, impossibly long, spanning nearly the entire pane. He stumbled back, heart in his throat. The print smeared down the glass as if dragged by something heavy. He dared to edge forward again. This time, the fog cleared. Not from his touch, but as though something outside was wiping it clean. The glass was empty. The scratching stopped. Near dawn, exhausted, Harold drifted into uneasy sleep. When he woke, the mug on the table had been tipped over, coffee staining the map. The words had changed. The warning was gone. In its place, "You shouldn't have stayed." He bolted from the cabin, stumbling into the trees. When he glanced back, the building stood silent, every window nailed shut from the inside. He never hunted that section of the forest again. Years later, hikers claimed to find the same cabin. Some swore the windows looked painted black. Others said the panes showed reflections that weren't theirs. Harold never spoke of it again. But he remembered. He remembered that sometimes the walls don't keep things out. Sometimes they keep things in. A cabin in these mountains isn't always a shelter. When you see windows nailed shut from the inside, take it as a message. Some barriers are not meant to be broken. And now, let us leave the nailed windows behind. Follow me down a forgotten path to the shore of a foggy lake where the water reflects things no one dares name. Walk with me down a forgotten trail to the shore of a fog-bound lake where the water throws back signals no one sent. People say lakes are honest. Rivers hide things by moving. Lakes keep them by staying still. I used to believe that until the night my cousin Nate asked me to help him check on a pair of anglers who hadn't come home. Summersville isn't far, but we weren't there. We were west of it, on a smaller, colder bowl of water with a gravel access road you'd miss if you blinked. Nate volunteers with search and rescue. It isn't as dramatic as folks imagine. Most nights it's twisted ankles and dead batteries. That night was supposed to be routine. 2 brothers took a John boat out at sunset, didn't answer texts by midnight. Wives worried. A call went out. We went down with a cooler of coffee and a sack of cheap flashlights that never fail until they do. The fog was already building from the water like breath on glass. You could smell cold clay and gasoline. The little dock groaned when we stepped on it, An empty canoe rocked itself as if it dreamt of waves. "There," Nate said quietly. On the far end of the shore, 2 camp chairs sat facing the water. One had a jacket thrown over it like a slumped shoulder. Between them, a tackle box, lid open, neat as a dentist's kit. Down in the sand, 2 sets of prints, crisp and deep, leading toward the water's edge. None coming back. We called out. The fog answered by growing thicker. I walked to the chairs and put my hand on the jacket. Still warm, not hot, not abandoned for long. "Boat?" I asked. "Truck's here," Nate said, swinging his light up the slope. "No trailer tag missing, they didn't put in." "Maybe they walked to a better bank," I said, though the sentence felt like I was saying it into someone else's mouth. We split 10 yards apart and circled the cove. 3 minutes in, my light caught something that wasn't rock or driftwood. A more regular shape. A cooler, not ours, white with a cracked lid. When I lifted it, the weight sloshed. Inside, meltwater around 2 unopened beers, a bundle of new line still in the wrap, and a lantern. The dry fuel kind with a glass chimney and a little brass lever. "Find something?" Nate called. "Yeah," I said, and the lantern chimed against the cooler wall, glass on plastic, bright as a bell. It made me jolt. I hadn't moved it hard enough for that. I set it on the sand. The wick looked used but neat, cut square. My thumb went to the wheel automatically, a habit older than sense. It lit on the first try. We both stood there, light gilding the fog into a halo. 2 moths appeared from nowhere, knocked themselves silly on the chimney and vanished again, like they'd flown 1,000 years to arrive for this exact mistake. "Look," Nate whispered. And I looked. Out on the water, maybe 30 yards. Not reflections, not logs, lanterns, dozens. No, that makes it sound like a parade. A handful, maybe 5 or 6, low to the surface as if lined up on the mirror of the lake. Nothing above them. No shadows of boats or men, just patient points of flame, each breathing to its own pulse. "Is there a marina down the way?" I asked, but the question was already wrong. Nate took a step into the water, just enough to wrinkle his boots. The lanterns on the lake held steady. The fog folded in around them and then loosened like a lung. "Hey!" he called. "You need help?" That's when every lantern on the water went out at once. Not blown, not starved of oxygen, snuffed. The dome of fog took on the tone of a held note. I felt it in my teeth. We both backed up slow. It wasn't fear of people out there doing a stupid, dangerous thing. It wasn't even thinking of bodies. It was older than that. The kind of backing up you do when a copperhead shows you your mistake and asks you to correct it without screaming. By the time we reached the chairs again, the jacket had fallen off the arm as if someone had sat down too hard and then stood abruptly. I picked it up. A name was stitched inside. Ben. White thread on a darker lining. Nate took out his phone, started the call he didn't want to make. The fog thinned, because fog always thins. Its trick is making you forget that it does. When the lake showed itself again, there were no lanterns, no boats, no footprints except the 2 sets that went in. We followed them to the water line, tried to see if the sand hinted at stagger or struggle. It didn't. It told a story of walking straight into a flat piece of glass and then finding nothing. We called in a proper search. Volunteers came with bigger lights and better radios. By dawn, we had a grid. By noon, we had drags. We found nothing. Not a hat, not a hook, not a scuff on a rock. 3 days later, one of the wives said she got a call at 2:13 a.m. She didn't pick up. She was trying to sleep for the first time. When she checked the voicemail, it was 9 seconds of hum and a delicate little ping like glass touched with a fingernail. The number showed as her husband's. The company said the tower never routed such a call. The handset was later recovered at home on his dresser, dead and dry. A week after that, the cooler we found was gone from evidence, not misplaced, signed out by no one. The log showed a blank line where a name should have been, and our search captain said very calmly, "We'll assume someone misfiled it." No bodies surfaced. That might be the most normal part. Lakes keep their secrets at their leisure. Nate doesn't go near water at night anymore. Sometimes he sees a flare through the trees, an impossible match struck above a black mirror, and he turns away before the part of himself that is still a rescuer insists on answering. If you reach a lakeshore and someone else's lantern lights itself for you, don't treat it like a welcome. Treat it like a boundary. Lakes can be honest, but at night, they're also host. Let's climb now, up out of the damp and into the ridge lines, toward a mountain house that keeps rearranging itself the moment you leave the room. Follow me up a steep road of switchbacks to a mountain rental that looks ordinary by day and perfectly wrong by night. Ever done a winter stay at a cheap ridgetop rental? The photos always lie a little. Angles flatter, colors warm, doorways widen themselves. This one was called Crow's Rest, a simple A-frame with a wrap deck and a view that ate the horizon. My friend Mara booked it for 3 nights to work on a grant proposal. She wanted solitude, not a haunting. The first afternoon was fine. Cold sun poured through glass. The fireplace drew well. The kitchen had exactly 1 sharp knife, which is all any kitchen needs if you're careful. She unpacked. She set her laptop on the table facing the trees and told me on the phone, laughing, "I'm a cliché. All I need is a mug with a deer on it." At dusk, the house changed its mind. Houses do that. Anyone who's slept through a mountain wind knows. The A-frame thrummed a little as the temperature dropped. The deck boards ticked. Ordinary. But it wasn't sound that warned her. It was arrangement. She went to the bathroom. When she came back, the curtain over the sliding glass door wasn't where she left it. She thought she remembered it drawn left. Now it lay right, as if someone had looked out and then set it back in a hurry. She shrugged. She's sane. Sane people do not narrate curtains. Later, she washed dishes. When she turned, the single knife was no longer on the cutting board but on the stove. Tip pointed toward the room. She had not moved it. She knows she hadn't, because she stands in kitchens the way journalists stand in bad neighborhoods, always cataloging exits and edges. She put the knife in the drawer and shut it like sealing a letter. At 11, she stepped outside to see if the stars would deliver. The cold had teeth, but the sky was worth it. She leaned on the rail and listened to the thin ticks of frost forming on wood. Somewhere down the slope, a fox barked, short and offended. She smiled, went back in, locked the door, and turned the deadbolt out of habit. At 1 in the morning, a cupboard banged, the kind of hollow thud that puts your spine on a string. She sat up. Silence. Then another, as if someone opened a door only to close it again with the heel of a hand, trying not to make noise and failing. She took her phone and used its light like a scalpel. The kitchen was empty. The drawer with the knife sat half an inch open. She had closed it tight. She closed it again. She whispered, "No," to no one in particular, as if declining a sales pitch. Back in bed, she listened. Houses settle in increments. This one seemed to practice. The heater clicked on and off in neat intervals, but in the silences between, something else took the stage. A slow, almost gentle scuff traveled along the wall behind the headboard from right to left, then back. Not rodents. A weight. A footfall without feet. She got up and pulled the bed away from the wall. Nothing there but baseboard and an outlet. She left the bed where it stood and sat on the floor, back to the dresser, phone in both hands, not ashamed to film the room like a nervous tourist. The video shows nothing. The audio, when replayed, shows a soft exhalation between heater cycles. The sound is like someone learning the room they just inherited. At 3:07 a.m., the lock on the front door ticked. It didn't turn, just acknowledged. Metal settled inside metal as if deciding. She took 1 step toward it and stopped because she did not want to meet the decision halfway. At dawn, she found smears on the sliding glass door, not fingerprints, not noses of curious raccoons. Smears at shoulder height, big arcs like someone wheeled in place with their hand on the glass, looking out and then away. From inside. The smears were on the inside. She cleaned them once and they came back faintly, like the glass remembered. She drove into the tiny town for coffee she didn't need just to watch other people carry keys that opened cars which took them elsewhere. The barista told her the house had been a long-term rental once. Older guy, she said, kept to himself, loved it up there. When he died, his nephew put it on short-term. You know how folks are with money. The barista shrugged. He wintered there a lot, alone. Mara went back for night 2 because humans are pride wrapped around fear. She moved the table so she could see both doors at once. She left the knife in the car. She put a sticky note on the sliding glass with a line she'd used to end a relationship. Please don't come through this way anymore. She laughed writing it because that's what humor is. Good armor that fails exactly when needed. At 11, the sticky note peeled off by itself and fell to the floor. Nothing else happened for 20 minutes. She almost convinced herself it had been gravity and cheap glue. Then from the bedroom, where the bed no longer touched the wall, came the soft sound of a hand running along drywall as if counting studs. She waited until morning light, then checked the wall. Right where the sound paused, there was a square of newer paint, just slightly whiter than the rest. She tapped it. Hollow. A patch over a cutout. She didn't pry it open. She didn't want treasure or a letter from a dead man or a nest. She wanted to leave the house arranged for someone else. She folded her laptop, packed the car, took one last look at the sliding glass door, and saw, faintly, her reflection misaligned by a fraction, as if a second picture of her had been taken and hung slightly to the left of the first. She told me later, it wasn't haunted, it was occupied, and not by anything dramatic, just by the last person who loved it too much to learn how to leave. If a mountain rental keeps moving your things by inches, it's asking you to learn its habits, not to change them. Don't argue with a house. Houses have all night to win. From a deck with a view, let S step down to a footpath no one bothers to map. An old game trail that narrows until even your breath has to walk single file. The mountains have a way of holding secrets, not in their valleys or caves, but in the places people abandon and forget. Tonight, I'll take you to one of those places. An old hunting cabin deep in the back country of West Virginia. A place where silence grew so thick that even the animals refused to linger. The story comes from a man named Jared, a hunter who had been raised in the Appalachian foothills. He had learned to walk with a rifle slung across his back before he could even drive, and the woods were his second home. But in 1994, he found himself at the center of something he still refuses to call supernatural, though his eyes, when he tells it, always drift away, as if the trees are still listening. Jared and 2 friends set out for a late autumn hunt. The deer season was in full swing, and they had heard rumors of an abandoned cabin about 6 miles off the main trail. Locals said it was built by coal miners decades earlier and later used by hunters. Some whispered that it had been deserted because men never came back from the hunts they began there. But hunters are a stubborn breed. Where there's shelter, there's opportunity. So they pushed off the trail, carrying rifles and heavy packs, with the first frost crunching beneath their boots. The hike was long and steep, but the promise of a roof over their heads kept them moving. By dusk, the forest had changed around them. The ridges grew steeper, the air colder, and the silence more complete. It wasn't the usual quiet of the woods. There was no rustle of squirrels in the leaves, no wings of birds in the branches, just stillness. They arrived at the cabin under a sky drained of light, and Jared swore it looked more like a mausoleum than a shelter. The roof sagged, the porch was half-rotted, and the windows were dark holes without glass. Still, it stood, waiting for them. Inside, the cabin was stripped bare except for a stone hearth and a few broken chairs. Dust lay heavy over everything, disturbed only by their footprints. They set up camp quickly, built a fire in the hearth, and laughed about the stories they had heard. Hunters were always spinning yarns to keep outsiders from their best spots, they said. It was nothing more than folklore. But as night deepened, the air inside seemed to thicken. The fire snapped, but the heat didn't reach them the way it should. Jared described it as sitting inside a bell jar, the air thin and pressing. Around midnight, one of his friends, Alan, claimed he heard scratching under the floorboards. The others teased him, told him it was a raccoon or a rat. But when Jared bent down, pressing his ear to the old wood, he heard it too. A dragging sound, like nails or claws being drawn across the beams beneath them. They tried to sleep, each wrapped tight in their sleeping bags, but the night did not loosen its grip. At some point, Jared woke to see the fire dying down. The room was steeped in a dim red glow. His other friend, Mike, was sitting upright, staring at the hearth. His face was pale, eyes wide. Jared followed his gaze. The stones of the fireplace were shifting. He swore he saw them breathe, expanding and contracting like lungs. Then came the sound, low and guttural, rising from deep within the chimney, a noise that made his teeth ache. Jared leapt to his feet, rifle in hand. But there was nothing to shoot at. Just the sound, growing louder, until a stone near the base cracked with a sharp pop, spilling dust into the room. They didn't wait. The three men grabbed their gear and stumbled outside into the cold. The woods, for all their darkness, felt safer than that room. But outside, the silence was worse. No wind, no rustle of leaves, only the pounding of their own hearts. And then, just as they thought they had left it behind, the cabin's door slammed shut behind them. No one had touched it. The sound was so loud it echoed off the ridge like a gunshot. Panic drove them down the slope. They moved without speaking, tripping over roots, tearing their hands on branches. Jared said it felt like the forest itself was pushing them away, branches snapping in their path, rocks sliding underfoot. They didn't stop until the first gray of dawn appeared between the trees. When they finally looked back, the ridge was empty. The cabin was gone. They marked the place on a map, swore they could find it again. But when they returned weeks later with more men, there was nothing but a bare patch of ground, overgrown with moss and brambles. No sign of a foundation, no stones, no porch, nothing. Jared tells this story quietly now, almost in a whisper when he speaks of it at all. He won't hunt that part of the woods anymore. He swears that sometimes, when the season turns and the frost begins to bite, he can still smell the acrid smoke of that fireplace on the wind. And maybe that is the strangest part, the way some places erase themselves when they refinished with you. A building should leave a mark, even when it collapses. But sometimes the mountain decides a secret is best buried. What do you make of that? A cabin that breathes, a chimney that groans, and a house that vanishes by dawn. Maybe it was never really a house at all. Maybe it was just the mountain itself, wearing the skin of one. And if the Appalachians can do that once, who's to say they haven't done it 1,000 times before? Because not every hunter returns with a story. Some never return at all. And that brings us to the next tale, where a mine abandoned for half a century still whispers with the voices of men who went down into the dark and never climbed back out. There are places in the Appalachians where the earth itself seems to remember every scream, every collapse, every life it swallowed whole. Mines, abandoned decades ago, still run like veins beneath the mountains, dark tunnels that once bled coal and men alike. Some were sealed off, others forgotten. But a few remain open, their mouths gaping as if still hungry. This story comes from 1978, told by a man named Robert who had worked the seams when he was young. He swore he'd never set foot in one again, not after what happened at the mine outside Hazard, Kentucky. The mine had been closed for years, shut down after a cave-in killed 7 men. The official report spoke of unstable rock, but locals believed otherwise. They said the men had heard voices before the collapse, low murmurs echoing from the dark, speaking words no one could understand. Some thought it was the mountain itself groaning. Others said it was something older, something buried deep that didn't want to be disturbed. Robert was 18 then, restless and reckless. He and two friends dared each other to go inside. It was a cool autumn evening, the sun already sinking, and the air sharp with coal dust even though the mine hadn't operated in over a decade. They carried nothing but flashlights and a pack of beer, thinking themselves invincible. The mouth of the mine yawned black, framed by rusting beams and weeds that had clawed their way through the soil. As they stepped inside, their voices bounced back to them, thinner, stretched, as if the tunnels wanted to swallow every word. The ground was uneven, littered with rusted tracks and the broken bones of carts. They hadn't gone more than a few hundred feet when the temperature dropped. Their breath fogged, their skin prickled. The deeper they went, the more Robert felt the weight of the mountain pressing down. His flashlight beam danced over graffiti left by older miners, names, dates, crude drawings. But among them was something stranger, long vertical marks carved deep into the rock, too clean, too precise for any pickaxe. One of his friends laughed it off, but Robert couldn't shake the feeling that the marks weren't just scratches. They looked like tally marks. Countless rows, as if someone, or something, had been keeping score. They pressed on until the tunnel widened into a chamber. Broken beams lay scattered, and in the center was a gaping hole where the floor had collapsed. The air pouring from it was colder than ice, carrying with it a stench that made them gag. Sulfur and rot. Robert's flashlight barely pierced the darkness below, but in that moment he swore he saw movement. Not the flutter of bats or rats, but something slow, deliberate. A shifting shadow that didn't belong. Then came the sound. Not the drip of water, not the creak of wood, but a voice, low, guttural, rising from the pit. It wasn't in English. It wasn't in any language Robert had ever heard. But it spoke with intent, syllables that made the ground tremble beneath their boots. His friends laughed nervously, trying to mask their fear, but the laughter died as another sound joined it. A chorus, faint at first, then growing louder. Dozens of voices, layered and discordant, chanting from the dark. Panic broke them. They ran, stumbling over tracks and debris, their flashlights jerking wildly. Robert swore the tunnel shifted as they fled, walls narrowing, shadows stretching, as if the mine itself was trying to keep them inside. At one point, his beam caught a figure at the far end of the passage, tall and thin, its head tilted unnaturally, watching them. But when he blinked, it was gone. They burst out into the night, lungs burning, and didn't stop running until the mine was a distant scar behind them. When they finally caught their breath, Robert noticed something chilling. His hands were covered in black dust, thick and oily, though he hadn't touched the walls. His friends had the same. The dust clung stubbornly, as if it didn't want to let go. By morning, it was gone. Their skin was clean, but the smell lingered. Sulfur, faint but unmistakable, and with it came the nightmares. For weeks after, Robert dreamed of tunnels collapsing, of voices whispering from the dark, of being dragged down into the earth. He never went back. The mine was later sealed, but Robert swore that sometimes on quiet nights you could still hear the chanting rising faintly from beneath the ground, carried on the wind. And maybe that's the truth about the mountains. They don't forget. Every collapse, every scream, every life taken, they echo on, deeper than we can hear. The earth itself remembers. But sometimes it's not just memory. Sometimes it's something still alive down there, something that wants to be heard. And speaking of voices, our next story isn't about a mine or a cabin, but a road. A lonely stretch of Appalachian highway where headlights are never truly alone and where travelers see shadows that walk just beyond the reach of their beams. There are roads in the Appalachian Mountains that don't show up on maps. Old timber routes, forgotten mining trails, stretches of cracked asphalt swallowed by forest. Some say they were abandoned because of landslides or lack of funding. Others whisper it was because of what people saw there at night, things headlights weren't meant to catch. This next story comes from a man named Jeremy, who in 1994 was driving through rural Virginia after visiting his brother. He knew the main highways well, but that evening he wanted to save time, so he cut across a lesser road locals called Crow Hollow. The road wasn't on official maps anymore. Only the locals remembered it, and they advised never driving it after dark. Jeremy thought they were exaggerating. He would learn otherwise. The sun had already bled out behind the ridges when he turned onto the hollow road. At first, it seemed ordinary enough, just two narrow lanes edged by thick walls of pine. His headlights reached only a few yards ahead before the darkness swallowed everything else. The trees pressed close, branches arching overhead like ribs, turning the road into a tunnel of shadows. Jeremy turned up the radio to break the silence, but the signal dissolved into static. He flipped through stations, nothing but hissing and faint voices that cut out as quickly as they came. After a few minutes, he switched it off. That was when he realized he couldn't hear the sound of his tires on the road anymore. The car was still moving, the wheels still in his hands, but the hum of rubber on asphalt had vanished. He slowed, cracked the window. Silence. The kind of silence that feels heavy, unnatural. Even the crickets and owls were gone, just his own breathing, too loud in his ears. Then the first figure appeared. At the curve ahead, his headlights swept across something standing by the roadside. It looked like a man, tall, thin, shoulders slumped forward. But its skin was ashen, gray-white, and its face was smooth. No eyes, no mouth, no nose. Just blank skin stretched where features should have been. Jeremy slammed the brakes. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch at the beams burning across it. For 3 heartbeats it stood there, faceless, tilted slightly toward him. Then, as if the dark had swallowed it whole, it was gone. Jeremy's chest tightened, his hands locked on the wheel. He tried to laugh, convince himself it was a trick of the light. He pressed the gas again, faster this time, eager to get off the road. But the farther he drove, the more the trees seemed to repeat. The same twisted oak, the same leaning pine. It was as if the road itself had curled into a loop. And then he saw more figures. First one, standing just beyond the reach of his headlights. Then another, perched up on the embankment like a crow on a branch. Each time he blinked or passed, they vanished. Always faceless. Always turned slightly toward him, as though they were watching without eyes. The air inside the car grew thick, pressing against his chest. His dashboard clock froze at 11:47 and refused to change. His gas needle began to sink far too quickly, though he'd filled the tank earlier that day. He gripped the wheel tighter and muttered aloud, just to hear his own voice. "It's nothing. Just keep driving. Just keep driving." But the road didn't end. Mile after mile, curve after curve, the forest and shadows repeating, the figures multiplying. Finally, in desperation, he slammed his hand on the horn. The blare cut through the night, sharp, defiant. For a second, the forest seemed to shiver. Dozens of pale faces emerged between the trees all at once, blank, smooth, their bodies motionless, lined in rows along the roadside. Jeremy's scream tore out of him as he floored the accelerator. The car roared forward, headlights bouncing wildly, the faceless crowd blurring past. His chest burned, tears streaming as he begged for the road to end. And then, suddenly, it did. The trees fell away, the asphalt merged onto the familiar main highway, and the night noises returned in a rush. Crickets, wind, the hum of his tires. His dashboard clock flicked to 12:04. The gas gauge reset to normal. He pulled over, shaking, drenched in sweat. When he finally forced himself to look back, Crow Hollow Road was gone. The turnoff was nothing but a wall of trees, no sign a road had ever been there. Jeremy never found the road again. Locals only nodded when he told his story, their eyes heavy with the weight of knowing. "Crow Hollow keeps who it wants," one old man said, "and lets go of the rest, if you're lucky." Jeremy was lucky. Others, maybe not. And that's the thing about Appalachian roads. Sometimes you think you're saving time, but the road has its own clock, its own path. And not everyone who takes it makes it back. But while roads can trick the living, the next story takes us deeper, to a cabin in the woods of North Carolina, where the dead themselves seem unwilling to leave, and the walls remember every voice that's ever spoken inside. Some cabins in the Appalachians look picturesque in the daylight, wooden porches draped with ivy, stone chimneys weathered by years of winter snow. But when the sun goes down, the air changes inside them. The timber creaks like bones, the silence feels heavier than it should, and sometimes the walls seem to listen. This story comes from a woman named Allison who, in the summer of 2007, rented a remote cabin in the North Carolina highlands for a week-long writing retreat. She'd been struggling with a novel and thought the isolation would help her focus. What she didn't know was that the cabin had a history, a series of tenants who never lasted more than a few nights. Allison arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. The cabin sat deep in the woods, down a dirt road that her rental car barely managed to climb. The place looked rustic but charming. Logs stacked in careful rows, a stone hearth, and windows that reflected the dense green of the forest around it. She carried her notebooks inside, set her laptop on the old desk near the fireplace, and told herself she would write every night until dawn. The first day passed quietly. She wrote, walked among the trees, watched the sun drop behind the ridges. But that evening, as she sat at her desk with only a lamp for company, she heard something faint, whispering. At first, she thought it was the wind. The cabin had gaps between the logs after all, and sound traveled strangely in the mountains. But as she leaned closer, she realized the voices were coming from inside the walls, low, murmured words, overlapping, too quick to separate into sentences. Allison froze. She tapped the wall with her knuckles. The whispers stopped. She laughed nervously, called herself overtired, and returned to her writing. At midnight, she closed her notebook and crawled into the narrow bed. She left the lamp on just in case. But when she began to drift into sleep, she heard the voices again. Stronger this time, closer, like they were gathering just behind the wood of the bedroom wall. She pulled the covers up to her chin and whispered aloud, "Hello?" The cabin went silent. Then in the dark, she heard a breath, long and slow, right beside her ear. Allison leapt from the bed, heart hammering. She snapped on every lamp she could find and paced the cabin until dawn, refusing to close her eyes. The next morning, exhausted, she packed her bag to leave. But when she opened the door, the forest outside didn't look the same. The dirt road she'd driven up was gone, swallowed by trees. She walked for nearly an hour, but every direction looped her back to the cabin. No matter which way she turned, the cabin waited at the center. That night, the voices grew bolder. They no longer whispered. They chanted, a low, droning rhythm echoing through the wood and stone. The words weren't English, weren't any language she recognized. Her glass of water on the desk began to vibrate with the cadence. The floorboards throbbed like a pulse. Allison clutched her phone and dialed 911. No signal. She dialed again, over and over, until she heard something click in her ear. A voice, not the operator, answered. "You shouldn't have called us," it said. A man's voice, hollow, amused. "You're already inside." The line went dead. She hurled the phone across the room and backed against the far wall. That was when the fireplace roared to life on its own. Flames shot up the chimney, crackling, throwing shadows across the cabin. And in those shadows she saw them. Shapes moving, stretching, too many arms, too many heads. Their mouths moved in time with the chanting, though no sound came from them. Allison screamed and fled outside into the night. But the forest had changed again. No stars, no moon, just blackness pressed between the trees. She ran until her lungs ached, tripped over roots, clawed through branches, until she saw the faint glow of the cabin's windows again. No matter where she went, the cabin found her. By the third night, she stopped trying to run. She sat at the desk, pen shaking in her hand, and began to write everything she heard. Every chant, every whispered phrase, she scribbled frantically across page after page. The words flowed through her faster than she could think, her hand cramping, her eyes burning. When morning finally came, she collapsed. The cabin was quiet again. The forest looked normal. The road had returned. Her phone buzzed with bars of signal. She staggered to her car, notebook still clutched under her arm, and drove until she reached town. Later, she opened the notebook to read what she had written. The pages were filled, edge to edge, with words in a language she didn't know, sharp, angular symbols repeated over and over. When she tried to show a linguist friend, he refused to look twice. He told her to burn it. She didn't. She still keeps the notebook locked away in her closet, though she swears the pages hum when she walks past at night. Allison never finished her novel. She never went back to the mountains. But she still hears the voices sometimes, just as she's falling asleep, as though the cabin walls followed her home. And in the Appalachians, they say cabins like that don't keep people inside for the sake of cruelty. They keep people inside to make them part of the walls. Another voice in the endless chorus. Which brings us to our next story. Because sometimes it isn't the walls that trap you. Sometimes it's the water itself, and what waits beneath it, patient in the dark. There's something about mountain lakes in Appalachia that makes people uneasy. Maybe it's the way the water looks darker than it should, like the trees press their shadows down until the surface becomes ink. Maybe it's the silence. No waves, no gulls, just stillness that waits for you to break it. Whatever it is, locals will tell you, don't swim alone and don't stay after nightfall. This story belongs to a man named Craig, who in 1998 drove up to Claytor Lake in Virginia for a weekend of fishing. He was a machinist from Roanoke, middle-aged, level-headed, not the kind of man who jumped at ghost stories. He brought his small aluminum boat, a cooler of beer, and a box of tackle. He planned to spend 2 nights on the shore, catch trout, and sleep under the stars. The first day went exactly as he imagined. He set up camp by the waterline, built a small fire, and cooked fresh fish in the pan. The lake was calm, glittering under the evening sun. Craig leaned back in his folding chair, lit a cigarette, and thought he'd found peace. But that night, around 2 in the morning, he woke to a sound, something splashing in the lake. At first, he figured it was a fish breaking the surface, but then came another splash, and another, each one closer to shore, as if something was wading toward him. Craig sat up, rubbed his eyes, and grabbed his flashlight. He swept the beam across the water. The surface rippled, black and oily, but he saw nothing. Just as he started to relax, the splashing stopped, and then, clear as day, came the sound of breathing. Slow, wet, guttural breaths, not from the woods, but from the lake itself. He stayed up until dawn, fire burning bright, shotgun across his lap. By morning, the water was calm again, and Craig laughed at himself for being spooked. He went back out on the boat, fished until noon, and told himself it had been nothing but a beaver or muskrat. The second night, he tried to sleep earlier, but just as his eyes shut, the breathing returned. Louder this time, closer. He snapped on the flashlight, heart pounding, and that's when he saw it. A figure was standing waist-deep in the lake, no more than 20 feet offshore. It looked like a man, broad shoulders, pale skin, but its face was wrong. Its head was tilted too far to one side, neck bent like a broken branch. Water streamed off it in sheets, dripping soundlessly back into the lake. Craig shouted, "Who's there?" The figure didn't move. It didn't blink. And then, as Craig raised his flashlight higher, it lowered itself back into the water, vanishing without a ripple. Craig didn't sleep after that. He sat by the fire, shotgun ready, every nerve screaming. But around 4 in the morning, he heard the voice. Craig. It was low, stretched, bubbling like it came through water. He spun toward the lake. No one was there, only his reflection in the black surface, except the reflection was wrong. His reflection's head tilted, just like the figure's had. Its mouth opened in a wide, drowning scream, though Craig himself made no sound. And then the reflection reached up from the water, as though to pull him in. He stumbled back, tripped over his cooler, and scrambled for the truck. He didn't pack, didn't fold his chair, didn't douse the fire. He just drove, headlights stabbing the dirt road until he reached the highway. Craig never went back to Claytor Lake. But when he told the story years later, his wife swore something followed him home. He'd wake some nights soaked in water, sheets dripping, though the bed itself stayed dry. He started hearing the breathing again, faint, just outside their bedroom window. And sometimes, when he shaved in the morning, he'd see his reflection in the mirror tilt its head, just slightly, like it remembered the lake. Locals say Claytor isn't the only lake like that in Appalachia. They say some waters remember the dead. Drownings, accidents, even old battles. Every body lost leaves something behind. And sometimes the water gets restless, trying to replace what it lost, which leads us into the next account. Because if the water wants you, maybe you can run. But if the mountain itself wants you, there's nowhere left to go. The mountains of Appalachia hold more than rivers and trees. They hold places people refuse to name. There are valleys on no map, barns left to rot because locals won't set foot inside, and paths that twist back on themselves like the land wants you lost. This last story comes from a woman named Donna, who in 2006 inherited her grandmother's farmhouse in McDowell County, West Virginia. It was a 2-story home tucked against the base of a ridge, with apple trees out back and a barn leaning like an old drunk. The land had been in the family since the early 1900s, and with it came stories Donna's grandmother never explained, just warnings. Don't go in the barn after dark, don't leave mirrors uncovered, and if you hear your name called from the ridge, don't answer. Donna was a nurse, pragmatic, not prone to superstition. When she moved in, she stripped wallpaper, painted the kitchen, and ignored the old warnings. For the first month, life was quiet. Then the noises began. It started with tapping at the windows, always around midnight. She assumed it was branches in the wind until she realized there were no branches near those windows at all. Then came the footsteps in the hallway upstairs, measured, heavy, like boots walking slowly from one room to the next. Donna lived alone. One night she woke to the smell of apples, sharp and sweet, though the trees outside hadn't borne fruit in years. She sat up, heart hammering, and saw that every mirror in the house, bathroom, hallway, even the little one above her dresser, was fogged over. Words began to appear in the condensation, letters scratched by unseen fingers. Welcome back. Donna tried to laugh it off, but the next day she covered every mirror with cloth, just as her grandmother had. For a while, the house fell silent. Then came the barn. She had avoided it for weeks, but one afternoon, curiosity won. She pulled the swollen doors open and stepped inside. Dust fell in soft columns of light. Old tools rusted on the walls. But at the center of the barn floor was a circle carved deep into the wood, burned black around the edges. It was no accident. It was deliberate, symmetrical, the kind of circle that felt like it was waiting for something. Donna backed out and nailed the doors shut. That night, she heard her name. Donna! It came from outside, soft, almost coaxing, rising from the ridge where the trees crowded close. She froze in bed, every warning her grandmother had ever whispered slamming back into memory. She didn't answer. But the next night, it came again. Louder, closer. Donna. By the third night, it was inside the house. She bolted upright, certain she was dreaming, until she saw her bedroom door inch open. The air smelled of apples again, cloying, sweet to the point of sickness. And there, standing in the doorway, was a figure. It looked like her grandmother, Same house coat, same silver hair. But the face was wrong, too smooth, too pale. Where the eyes should have been, there were only shadows. The figure tilted its head and whispered, "Come to the barn." Donna screamed and threw the lamp. When the light shattered, the figure was gone. But the smell lingered, and so did the open door. She fled that night. Didn't pack, didn't lock up. She drove until dawn, hands shaking the wheel, and never returned. The farmhouse still stands abandoned, curtains rotting in the windows, the barn sealed with rusted nails. Locals say if you walk past on a quiet night, you can still hear a woman's voice calling from the ridge, patient, insistent, asking for someone to answer. And the mirrors inside? They're all cracked now. Each one splintered from the center out as if something tried to come through. So, if you ever find yourself deep in the back roads of West Virginia and see an old house with apple trees by the fence line, don't slow down, don't stop. And whatever you hear, don't answer. Because in the Appalachians, silence is not empty. The land itself listens. And when it finally calls your name, you may not get the chance to refuse.